The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 4, Dragon and Herdsman. Chapter 18. They gathered their traveling companions together, and with Allison and Greenie in the lead, they once again headed north toward the river. Jack had hoped to stay close to Allison during the march, or at least to find time here and there to check on her. But with the Kodiak's attack now in the, for them, distant past, the Pukas and Arasvas had settled back into their old careless ways. The Pukas again wandered freely, rushing off to grab a quick bite or see something interesting, and Jack again found himself being run off his feet trying to keep the herd together. The Arasvas, for their part, began complaining about their thirst in increasingly loud voices. If the mercenaries were anywhere nearby, Jack thought sourly, they'd be able to find their quarry with their eyes alone, not to mention with their eyes closed. Fortunately, after only about 20 minutes, the travelers found a stream. Everyone drank their fill, and with the Erasmus now at least quieter, they continued on. The forest water supply seemed to be getting more abundant, Jack noticed as he jogged back and forth, keeping the Pukas in line. They were crossing more and more streams now, most of them reasonably narrow, but a few wide enough to make the travelers get their feet wet as they crossed. Possibly as a partial result of the increased water supply, new plants and trees began to make their appearance. One of them was a purplish knee-high shrub with 2-inch thorns that reminded Jack of the hedge wall back at the Chakooks family estate on Brummagem. The thorns didn't seem to bother the Pukas any, but after nearly impaling his shin on a pair of the shrubs, Jack learned to watch for them and keep his distance. Another newcomer was a tall, spindly, and rather rubbery tree that liked to grow in widely spaced groups of 5 to 12. Fortunately, they also seemed to come associated with a thin but strong pale green vine that grew at all angles between the various members of a given group. Together, they formed a net-like structure that had a bad tendency to block off the best routes through the forest. The vines were too tough for Jack's and Allison's knives to get through easily, especially since the springy trees they were attached to didn't provide a solid foundation for cutting. That meant that whenever the travelers couldn't go around a group, they had to call in Dracos to slash open a path. Jack tried several times to get the other Pukas to help out, but the concept of using their claws to cut vines that weren't concealing food seemed to be completely foreign to them. Fortunately, not all the new flora was determined to make their lives more complicated. There was also a yellow-leafed bush with bright red berries that was greeted with great enthusiasm by the Erasves. As near as Jack could gather from Friend's explanation, mumbled through a mouthful of the berries, it was a plant that grew near the river and was one of the highlights of their continuous journey around the forest's edge. The first group of bushes they ran into generated a half-hour delay as Arasva and Puka alike happily stood around stuffing their faces. Allison wasn't happy with the delay and wasn't shy about saying so. But Jack knew that after the scare they'd had earlier, a treat like this would help boost the Arasvas's morale. Sure enough, when they finally hit the trail again, the uneasy grumbling was gone. They didn't see any more Kodiaks that afternoon, but near sundown they did run into another herd of the horn-headed plant-eaters Dracos had told Jack about. The creatures themselves were about the size of large elk, with roundish bodies and rather mouse-like faces. Each had 2 sets of horns, one that looked like extra-long wild boar tusks set into the sides of their heads, just behind their mouths, plus a second set further back that reminded Jack of the flat fan shapes of moose antlers. Non-predators or not, Allison made sure to give them a wide berth. With the day's delays clearly on her mind, she kept them going until the blue had faded from the sky overhead, before finally calling a halt. With Dracos's help, Jack got the Erasvas and Pukas settled amid a grove of rubbery trees, situating them where the vine mesh would give them protection from predators from at least that direction. Then, leaving Dracos on guard, he went to find Allison. He found her kneeling beside a stream 20 yards farther along their path, filling her canteen. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Never better. Why?" "Why do you think?" Jack growled, studying her profile as he crouched down beside her. She certainly looked okay. "Tanim been giving you any trouble?" "Not really," Allison said. There was a time a couple of hours ago when she felt kind of itchy, and back when we were crossing that extra wide creek, she was moving around or something and tickling me. Probably bringing her claws a little ways into their 3D form and scratching your skin, Jack said. Dracos does that sometimes in his sleep. Never tickles, though. You're probably not as ticklish as I am, she said, pulling her canteen from the creek and recapping it. Do I need to get her off me for a while or anything? Jack shook his head. The only limit is how long they can stay off you, he said. Dracos once had to stay on me for 3 days straight, and it didn't seem to bother him any. Except probably drove him a little stir-crazy, Allison said, getting back to her feet. Do we want to bring them in shifts for some water, or just move the whole camp here for the night? Let's do the shift thing, Jack suggested. If the mercs decide to come hunting, they'll probably expect us to park by water. Good point, she said. Okay, if you and Dracos want to start shuttling them over, I'll take guard duty with the main group. Right, Jack said. By the way, how many rounds does your Corvine have left? 11, Allison said. We'd never make it through another firefight like the one we had 2 nights ago. I'll keep that in mind. The stars were starting to appear through the treetops by the time they finally finished getting everyone to the stream and back. Only then, as they settled in for the night, did Jack and Dracos finally have a chance to talk. What do you think? Jack asked quietly as they sat together. I see no signs of trouble, Dracos said, though I am a little concerned about the fact that Tanim stayed with her the entire day instead of coming off to eat. It sounded like she was sleeping a lot of that time, too, Jack said, frowning across at Allison. She was little more than a dark silhouette against the fading light, sitting against the vine netting, her head slumped forward onto her chest. Is that abnormal? Not necessarily, Draco said. It sometimes takes a while to adjust to a new host, especially when the Kada is young. Of course, Tanim is an adult. On the other hand, this is a radically different host than the one she's used to, Jack reminded him. True, Draco said, clearly still not convinced. Or else he was simply afraid to let himself hope that anything would come from the experiment. She may simply come off Allison very well rested. No, there's more going on here, Jack said, scratching his cheek. Remember the red puka who fell down that cliff? He didn't want anything to do with me, and in fact resisted the whole idea until it was either that or run off the end of his time limit. And even then, he got off me just as soon as he could. I'm certain he found the change confusing. Confusing and uncomfortable both, Jack agreed. Tanim, on the other hand, seems to have taken to Allison like a cat to nip. For a moment, Dracos was silent. We will have to wait and see, I suppose, he said at last. On another more serious subject, did you hear the air vehicle passing back and forth over the forest for much of the afternoon? No, I didn't, Jack said, frowning. How come you didn't say something earlier? Because you and Allison were busy, the Kada said. Also, there was little that either of you could do about it. We could have gotten ourselves ready for an ambush, Jack countered. Dracos twitched his tail in a negative. There was no indication that the vehicle was landing nearby. It was not flying directly overhead, but instead along a course a kilometer or more to the east of our path. So either they were out looking for us, Jack said slowly, or else they already knew where we are and are setting up another picket line in front of us. The latter would be my guess, Draco said. I thought that once it's full night, I would scout ahead. Sounds good, Jack said. Only this time you're going to have company. Jack! No argument, Jack said firmly. I need to know what's going on out there. Anyway, you'll be there with me. What can go wrong? The dragon sighed. Very well. Do you wish to tell Allison, or shall I? Jack looked across at Allison. Let's let her sleep, he decided. But you'd better make a pass around the area before we go. Make sure no one's close enough to sneak up on the camp. The forest was alive with the same nocturnal creatures Dracos had seen on their 2 previous nights. Fortunately, there were no hunting mercenaries among them, nor did he see or smell any of the creatures Jack had dubbed Kodiaks, or the horn-headed plant-eaters whose presence might attract such predators. The only even mildly dangerous creatures were small predators similar in size to the hyenas he and Jack had encountered at the Vagran colony spaceport soon after they met. Unlike the hyenas, though, these animals hunted alone instead of in packs, and seemed to concentrate their efforts on small rodent-like creatures. The likelihood that they would take on a group of pukas, Dracos decided, was small enough to safely ignore. He returned to the encampment to find Jack ready. "I thought we'd take about 100 feet of rope, my tangler and my knife," the boy said. "You think of anything else we need?" "I believe that's most everything we have, actually," Dracos pointed out. "The area appears to be secure. Let us go." They set off through the woods. Only a little of the starlight overhead made it through the forest canopy, but that was enough for Dracos to find his way without difficulty. Jack, for his part, held onto Dracos' tail and let the Kada guide him. They'd been hiking for perhaps 40 minutes when they reached the mercenaries. "I don't see anything," Jack whispered as they lay side by side behind a wide tree trunk. "They are there," Dracos assured him, flicking out his tongue as he tasted the air. "There is a hidden ground line of 7 men, approximately 50 feet apart, stretched directly across our path." "I hear running water," Jack said. "Another creek?" "A fairly wide one, yes," Dracos confirmed. "The soldiers are hidden on the far side." "So we come strolling up to get a drink and they pop us," Jack said. "There's probably a gap in the trees right over the stream, too, so you can't use the skyway and jump them from behind." "Yes, there is a gap," Dracos confirmed. "But even if there weren't, I could not easily use such a frontal attack. A few yards behind each man is a second soldier, hidden off the ground in some of the trees." "Sounds like the same setup you ran into on the first day out of the box," Jack said, a frown in his voice. "Don't these people learn?" "Of course they learn," Draco said. "But they have no way of knowing that I've seen this particular ambush strategy." "Ah, right," Jack said, nodding. "That group was waiting northwest of us while we were headed north. We never even got near it." "And so they try again," Dracos concluded, tasting the air a few more times just to be sure. But there were no other surprises waiting for them. At least, none that could be detected by Kada's senses. If there were more subtle booby traps around, it would be up to Jack to find and disarm them. "So what do we do?" Jack asked. Carefully, Dracos lifted his head for a better view. There were, he saw, bushes and stands of reeds all along their side of the stream. Plenty of cover for a hunting Kada to creep in close. The stream itself was fairly wide and seemed to be flowing reasonably slowly. From the calmness of the surface, he guessed the stream was at least a couple of feet deep. He lowered himself back down. "Come," he said, gesturing behind them. "I have a plan." Together, he and Jack backed away from the ambush line. "We will need a dummy," Draco said when it was safe to talk. "Can you construct something from branches and vines?" "Probably," Jack said. "You want human or Kada?" "Human will do," Draco said. "Give me the rope. I'll be back soon." With the rope coiled beneath his left foreleg, he headed a few yards further back from the enemy until he found one of the slender, rubbery trees that had begun cropping up during the day's travels. Near its base, another tree's roots had looped their way up into the air before disappearing back underground. Picking the thickest of the roots, he tied one end of the rope to it. With the other end clenched between his teeth, he started up the rubbery tree. He was no more than 15 feet up when he felt the trunk starting to bend under his weight. He kept going, digging his claws into the soft bark to keep from being dumped off, until the tree was bending over so far that he was climbing nearly horizontally. Tying the other end of rope there, he headed down. Once back on the ground, he spent a few minutes pulling the rope through the root loop, bending the treetop back down again. It was a tricky job, requiring all his strength to keep the rope from being yanked out of his muzzle and paws as the tree bowed over and the tension on the rope increased. Finally, he judged he'd pulled enough of it through. Holding the rope tightly between his teeth, bracing his hind legs against the root loop, he slipped a section of the rope through another nearby tree root and secured it with a quick release knot. Then, carefully, he eased off his grip. There was a sharp jerk as the bent tree readjusted itself, startling a group of birds who had been picking seeds or insects out of the topmost branches. They all flew off madly together in a tight cluster, sending the treetop swaying in the opposite direction and putting a twitch of extra tension on the rope and knot. But the knot held and the branches settled down. Now one good tug on the loose end of the rope would release the knot and let the tree straighten up again, pulling the rope through the looped root as it did so. Back on the planet Sunright, he'd pulled a version of this trick on one of the Wynyard Edge's soldiers. This time, though, he wasn't looking for a prisoner for interrogation. This time, it was going to be a prelude to combat. Gathering the rest of the rope in a loose coil, he returned to where he'd left Jack. "Mortimer's all ready," the boy said, holding up the Jack-sized stick figure he'd made from branches, wrapped and held together with vines. "What do you think?" "It looks just like you," Draco said. "Thanks," Jack said dryly. You can probably find a reed down by the creek to use as a breathing tube." Dracos frowned at him. "How did you know I was going to send the decoy down the stream?" "Didn't you?" Jack broke off. "No, I guess you didn't tell me." "Huh, that's weird." "Great minds thinking alike, no doubt," Draco said. "Though you have no doubt already deduced it, let me tell you the rest of the plan." It took only a minute for him to fill Jack in. "Yeah, that's more or less what I was expecting," the boy said. "We're starting to think alike, all right. Not sure whether that's good or bad." "For the moment, let us assume it's good," Draco said. "Now help me get, what did you call it? Mortimer. Help me get Mortimer on my back. Then carefully move up into position." "Don't worry about me," Jack said. "You just watch yourself, okay? I'm the one they don't want to kill." "That thought had occurred to me," Dracos agreed grimly. "I shall be back as quickly as I can."